In the frontier days of the American West, the chuck wagon was a mobile kitchen. In my Agile chuck wagon, I have the Agile, the Lean, the leadership, the programming techniques you need to bring your bland software implementation to life. You bring the project, I'll bring the fire. Let's get cooking. Hello, Chuck here with a quick favor. If you like the Agile Chuck Wagon, I would appreciate if you would go out to your podcast provider, iTunes, Stitcher, whatnot, and give the podcast a favorable review. That will help other people find the podcast and help us grow. Thanks. Hello, today on the Agile Chuck Wagon, we are talking about Lent. Now, Lent might seem like a strange topic for a software development business sort of podcast. It doesn't fit neatly into Agile, Lean, leadership, or programming techniques, but please hear me out. Repeat listeners of the podcast know that I am a Christian. I'm not a Catholic, but often at this season of the year I will observe Lent to some degree. Much like the Gregorian calendar is not the only possible calendar to measure time, there are of course things like the Islamic calendar that are measured by phases of the moon. The Catholic Church divided the year into seasons which corresponded with various phases of Jesus' life. Of those, Lent is probably the most widely known. Lent extends for about 6 weeks before Easter, starting with Ash Wednesday. Lent is a season of sacrifice. If you're familiar with the Gospel, you know that the story of Jesus is all about sacrifice. God sacrificed His only Son to pay for our sins. And so by emulating God and sacrificing something that is important to us, it allows us some empathy into God's position in this story. And it reinforces one of the main lessons of the gospel, and that is that love is sacrifice. So even though I'm not Catholic, I will often practice some sacrifice at this time of the year as a spiritual practice, which brings me closer to God. This particular year, I chose to give up caffeine. As many of you are probably aware, caffeine is one of the most addictive substances to the human body, and it can be difficult to cut out caffeine. I chose caffeine because I am on a high-stress software delivery project at the moment, and I found that I was consuming a lot of coffee in the mornings, so much so that I was skipping lunch, and I knew that this was not a healthy habit for me to be in, and I also knew it would be hard to give up. One of the key parts of Lent is that you give up something that is valuable to you. There can be no sacrifice without temptation. Although this episode is scheduled to air just before Easter, I'm actually recording it a couple of weeks beforehand, so I'm about halfway through. And the thing that has surprised me the most is that it wasn't the coffee that was so difficult for me to give up. Of course, I experienced the normal headaches that occur when you don't have caffeine for a few days, but they were milder than I expected them to be. No, what really got me was chocolate. Chocolate is a great source of caffeine, and it's a slow release in your body as opposed to something like coffee, which is a fast release. So if you are interested in studying all night long for an exam, then I would recommend that you eat some dark chocolate rather than drink coffee the whole night. You'll have less spikes that way. I proved this out once when I was at a development boot camp and we had an all-night session as part of the boot camp. The idea was to help teach people to push past their boundaries and figure out what their breaking points were. And a lot of people had gotten energy drinks like Red Bull, some people had gotten coffee, and I chose to get some Hershey's Special Dark Chocolate because that's what they happen to have at the store. A lot of people started giving me a hard time about this, but when it started to get 2 or 3 o'clock and they were beginning to hit their wall and crashing, and I was still coherent and making progress on the project we were working on, they became believers. I was reminded of a lesson that I've learned before and since forgotten, and that is that I tend to use food as a reward in my life. And when I was either having a difficult day or wanting to celebrate a win, I found myself gravitating toward dessert, especially chocolate desserts. And this makes a certain amount of sense because chocolate has quite a bit of PEA, which is phenethylamine, because phenethylamine causes the body to produce endorphins. It's a natural high. So with that context, let's talk about Lent and Agile. I've spoken on previous podcasts about this idea of lean experiments, where you create these build, measure, learn cycles. At work we practice SAFe, and so we talk about plan, do, check, act cycles. The idea is the same here. When you're doing Scrum, you do a couple of weeks of work, then you retrospect on that work, and you think about something that you could change that might make you more effective. And I've talked about doing that in the style of an experiment, not committing to the change until you've measured it and have determined that it had a positive impact. A lot of times when people give examples of experiments to run in Agile contexts, they are additive experiments. Let's try adding something new to our process. That often can yield positive results because as the team becomes more mature in their Agile practice, they're ready to try more things at the same time. They're ready to try more complicated styles of practicing Agile. However, there are different experiment possibilities besides just adding something. The other that probably comes to mind is the idea of changing something. But that's not what I'm speaking about on this podcast, which is about Lent. On this podcast, I am talking about creating experiments that remove something. Experiments that are seen as removing something vital to your process, something important. In this season of Lent, I am suggesting to you that you run Agile experiments to sacrifice an important part of your process. Maybe you are writing software. You might choose to give up doing code reviews. At first blush, that might sound like a terrible idea. Code reviews are a vital way that developers can ensure code quality. Why would you want to give up a practice that can provide so much value? The approach to take here is not, we're not going to do code reviews at all and see how badly it tanks our delivery system. The mindset here is to think, I am sacrificing code reviews. What value do code reviews bring to my overall delivery process, and what can I do instead to satisfy those concerns? Again, going back to my Lenten experience this year, I replaced my morning cups of coffee with water. Now, plain water is a challenge for me. I know that there are people who can drink a gallon of water a day and they enjoy it, and to them it's neither here nor there. But for me, I find that I don't tend to go back to the water during the day. I'll drink the minimum I need to survive, but after that it isn't a draw. What I have found, though, is that flavored water is a lot more of an incentive to me. So the end result for me after a few weeks is that I'm a lot more hydrated than I was before. As you probably know, caffeine, at least in the doses that I was taking, at 3 or 4 cups of coffee a day, is a diuretic. In other words, it was taking water from my body and encouraging me to excrete it as urine, which in combination with not liking to drink water in the first place ended up meaning that I was chronically mildly dehydrated. This can lead to weight gain and a bunch of other problems. So I've been flavoring my water with things like Tang or Country Time lemonade, although there's sugar in these products and that's not good. I tend to use them at a low dilution, so I will use maybe half of what the recommended amount is, because I'm just trying to get my water to have a little bit of flavor. As I'm sitting and recording this podcast, what I really ought to do would be to say buy a lemon, slice it up, put it in baggies, keep it in the fridge at work, and then put lemon in my water. But maybe that's the next step in my experiment. Back to our Agilists who are thinking about cutting off code reviews. What are some things that they could do instead of having developers look at their code? Well, one thing that comes to mind is the techniques of behavior-driven development. Behavior-driven development is a way of creating tests that have meaning to your end users. These test specifications are written in the language of the business as opposed to the language of programming. One thing that you could do would be to have your development teams working on building these kinds of tests and thinking through the scenarios of different things that could happen during the execution of this particular component. Thinking through the ramifications of these features. Would it be as good as a black box examination of the code? My guess would be if you ran this experiment that you would find it is not as good as code reviews. There's a reason that code reviewing is such a prevalent practice in software development. The point is, though, that by sacrificing code reviews and trying to figure out different ways to achieve the same goal, you may find some practices that will augment the effectiveness of your code reviews. Another example from work is that our QA group requires us to create these test design specification documents. I suspect that if we ran that experiment on a team who had an experienced QA person or two, that we would not see much of a loss of quality and we would see an increase in productivity. The TDS documents were put in place by the QA director because we have a strong ratio of junior QA people to senior QA people. And with most of the people in his department being a junior and not understanding what needs to be tested, having a job aid like this test specification document makes sense. On my teams, however, I have a senior QA person, and they find the TDS to be redundant. Not only are they required to create these TDS documents, but they're also required to create test cases in a tool. We use Qtest, and those two have some overlap. It's a little bit like when you were back in school writing essays and you were required to write an outline before you wrote your paper. For some people, they found outlining to be an important organizational tool. For people who preferred discovery writing as a tool to figure out what they wanted to say in their essay, the outline was an extra step. The key takeaway from this episode is that you can use subtractive experiments in the style of Lent in order to inform some of the process decisions that you're making. So your homework is to give it a try and then let us know how it goes. Until then, I wish you success in your Agile endeavors. It's time to pack up the Agile Chuck Wagon for now. The Agile Chuck Wagon podcast is written, directed, and produced by Chuck Durfee. Chuck is a software development manager and Agile coach in the Denver area. Thanks to Audionautics.com and freesound.org for the backing music and sound effects. You can reach this podcast on Twitter at AgileChuckWagon or by email at chuck@agilechuckwagon.com for comments and episode suggestions. Please also visit our Patreon page to support this podcast and learn about membership benefits. Thank you very much for listening.